Welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations, a series of short and shareable conversation starters for those of us who have or love and support people with a complicated and beautiful brain. Here's your host, Angela Geddes.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Kitchen Table Conversations. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I am having a very hard time believing that it's already July, and I say this every year, and I kind of laugh at myself, but I don't know. The time just does seem to be going quicker and quicker. And I hope that July is treating you well so far. I want to spend a little bit of time today, again, kind of following up and focusing a little bit more on neurodivergence and what we as a system seem to be including when we discuss neurodiversity. Again, September the 9th is just around the corner. And it is the day that we globally kind of stop and recognize fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so I do want to stay on theme with that. I think most of you know that I am pretty passionate about raising awareness and drawing attention to a very complicated developmental disability that largely goes unrecognized, and it continues to go unrecognized. As a matter of fact, I'm just doing a quick Google search this morning and talking about neurodivergent conditions, for example. And when I look online, I look in various places, and it says things like the most common neurodevelopmental disorders are autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. When I look at another site, it talks about nervous system disabilities, sensory-related disabilities, metabolic disabilities, and degenerative disorders. Another one talks about 8 neurodevelopmental disorders, which include attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, also known as mental retardation, conduct disorders, cerebral palsy, and impairments of vision and hearing. So those are just some examples. When I look online, and there's just been so much activity around neurodivergence lately, which I'm really glad about. And frankly, I love the inclusive title of neurodivergence, because really what we're talking about is just variances in the way that our brain functions and things that are a little bit different. So we don't have to pathologize all of these differences, and we certainly can affirm and celebrate some of these differences and the creativity and the love and the kindness and the compassion and the tolerance and the resilience that we see in so many of the people that we love and support. And I certainly professionally in my practice, I see a lot of people who celebrate and struggle with some of their brain-based differences. And that's, like I said, I really appreciate the term neurodivergence and am very excited about the inclusivity of that term. However, there's always a however or a but. I'm not finding that the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure or prenatal substance exposures are being included underneath this umbrella, which makes me very sad. And it also makes me feel very frustrated, because there still is this sort of us against them mentality and this stigma that's attached to prenatal conditions that are directly related to prenatal substances. And when I talk about nervous system disabilities, sensory related disabilities, metabolic disabilities, and degenerative disorders, all of those can be, and I'm saying can be, not necessarily absolutely the cause, but can be related to prenatal substance use. So we're still missing, quite a bit. And when I think about examples of neurodevelopmental disorders, which include attention difficulties, autism symptoms, learning disabilities, conduct disorders, impairment in vision and hearing, I see all of those symptoms in my practice with people who have finally got a diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I think it's really, really important to emphasize the fact that diagnostic services for people who have been impacted by prenatal exposures are really, really, really limited. Really limited. I was a coordinator of a diagnostic diagnostic services or assessment services here in London, Ontario, for a few years with a pilot project that was funded through Trillium. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, but the majority of my time, it seemed, was spent talking to families, telling them that I'm sorry, we don't have space for you. We'll have to put you on a wait list. We had funding for 10 assessments per year. Now, we were creative, we were motivated to build capacity, and we have built capacity and clinical skills so that more assessments can continue to take place outside of that specific clinic, which I'm pretty proud about. However, there's still the need far outweighs our current capacity. And recent research from Dr. Lana Popova confirms that in Ontario, fewer than 1% of the people who should have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder diagnosis actually have had access to any assessment in that way. So that means out of the 600 and some thousand Ontarians that would qualify for an FASD diagnosis, they basically none of them know it. So when you think about the people who have been assessed, they are the ones that have notable variances and differences and struggles and challenges, and or they've been there with families who are astute enough to really look at the developmental stages and recognize that there's something not right and either pay for an assessment or advocate with everything in them in order to get one. So what I'm saying is what our understanding of what fetal alcohol spectrum disorder actually is very limited. And that's the reason why I wrote a book called A Complicated and Beautiful Brain. Because for those people who are really struggling with very obvious developmental and learning challenges, we know how to support them. I mean, we still have a ways to go. There's a lot of nuances that come with prenatal exposure that make it trickier than some of our other more commonly understood learning disabilities, etc. So we still have a ways to go. But when people are obviously struggling, and if they have facial features, for example, or if they're physically walking with a little bit of a gait, or there's some obvious developmental milestones that are being missed, then it's very clear, and we all know to wrap around and support and accommodate and even modify so that people can live their best life and reach their potential. I wrote my book, A Complicated and Beautiful Brain, to help identify some of the more subtle symptoms that we see that are overlapping and often misunderstood and misdiagnosed. And so when I look at what we see as neurodivergence on our social media in particular, I'll give you an example. There's a neurodivergent umbrella that came up on my Instagram the other day, and it listed a number of conditions, many of which I've never even heard of actually. But I can tell you that ADHD is there, bipolar is there, dyslexia is there, dyspraxia is there, sensory processing disorder is there, post-traumatic stress is there, complex post-traumatic stress is there, dysgraphia is there, autism is there, bipolar is there, epilepsy is there, OCD is there, and some tic disorders, and also schizophrenia, Down syndrome, etc. But nowhere on this list is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so my question is, why? Why are we still not including the most common developmental disability here in Canada and in many parts of the world? Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is more common than autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and Tourette's syndrome combined. And when we look at these conditions that are listed here, I personally don't know anybody that has FASD that doesn't also have ADHD. Many of the people that I see have diagnosed with conduct disorder, again, ADHD, autism, OCD, anxiety, depression, dyslexia for sure, epilepsy is a big one, mood disorders, including bipolar, are definitely part of the condition that we see, or some of the symptoms that we see. So there's a ton of overlapping conditions, but yet there's very little recognition to what contributes to many of these symptoms, which is prenatal exposures, including alcohol, which is probably the most common substance that we use, and particularly in our culture. But in other cultures, like Ireland, for example, and France, it's even more common that babies are exposed quite regularly to alcohol. And again, there's still such resistance to understanding that there are serious risks. And I get it. We have a relationship with alcohol, and I'm not here to say that people whatever you decide to do around what substances you choose to consume, that's one thing. But we need to help spread the message around the risks associated with pregnancies and do our part, all of us collectively, to make sure that all pregnancies are as healthy as they can be. So I did want to spend a little bit of time just kind of talking about my book again, because I'm pretty passionate about this, and I'm pretty pleased with the responses that we're getting so far. I know that this book is game-changing, but I also know that this is a topic that people aren't real crazy about learning, and there is a terrible stigma that continues to be associated with mental health conditions of all kinds, but particularly those that are linked to alcohol consumption. And I'm here to say that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a spectrum, but in order to meet criteria, there are serious impacts on your day-to-day living. So this is not I don't like to hear people say, well, yeah, they're just, they're high functioning FASD or lower functioning FASD. And yes, naturally, the more interference by various substances throughout pregnancy, the larger degree of difficulties and more health-related impacts are going to be seen, without question. But in order to qualify for an FASD diagnosis, there are at least 3 brain domains, and I've never seen just 3, but at least 3 brain domains that are significantly impacted by like 2 standard deviations, which is pretty extreme differences. So, we can learn more about that, but I just don't want people to think that, oh yeah, it's a spectrum of disorders, so he's just got a little bit of it, so he should be able to pull up his socks and carry on and learn like the rest of us, because that's just not true. However, alcohol during pregnancy in smaller amounts can still result in ADHD or mood disorders or sensory processing issues, or maybe some milder speech delays and some behavioral challenges that maybe wouldn't meet criteria for FASD, but are still concerning and challenging for both parents and family members and the individuals themselves. So there is a lot of opportunity for prevention. And I think, as I've always said, when we know better, we can do better. So let's help spread that word. So I just wanted to say that, my book, again, is called A Complicated, Beautiful Brain. I've had some really, really, really good feedback from students that's told me that it's game-changing, from individuals who have later found out that they have FASD, who've read the book, that literally wept through it and for the first time in their lives could read it and see themselves within the pages, and that alleviated so much blame and shame and confusion around why they continued to struggle. When they had all kinds of supports and they worked so hard and they tried so very hard to improve their circumstances. So for me, that means everything, but it also meant a great deal to hear Dr. Peter Choate recommend my book along with Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You. Imagine my surprise when he recommended my book with that one in the same sentence. I'm still in shock about that, but thrilled, and sending out the energy and ask you all to help me to see whether there's a way that I can connect with Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry more directly, because I do believe that a lot of the people that we see who experience trauma and intergenerational trauma often are impacted by intergenerational mental health and trauma, and intergenerational substance use and misuse. So our trauma supports also have to be enhanced or customized a little bit in order to be more inclusive of the fact that some of the symptoms that we're seeing that we may think is directly related to trauma might also be a little bit further brain-based by that interference. And so when we're talking about developmental trauma and then other traumas that add to it, that's even more complicated. And sometimes when we don't understand the impact of the initial brain interference and brain-based condition like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and we don't understand the impulsivity and the confabulation and the inconsistent memories and those, just really the inconsistent performance, I guess. And when we don't understand that, sometimes we blame parents and the natural circles for not meeting those developmental needs and not meeting those relational needs when people have experienced trauma. And when we do that, we actually can create or perpetuate trauma, because when people are not seeing the results that they're expecting from their efforts, according to the trauma experts. For example, sometimes that can be traumatic when we feel like, oh my goodness, what are we doing wrong? This child is still really struggling with some really puzzling behaviors and aggression, for example, or property damage, or just not being able to sit still in school or to run away or just to not be responsive and emotionally connected the way we would expect given our efforts. So these are big deals. I see them every single day in my practice, but I wanted to refer back to the Google search. And when we talk about neurodevelopmental disorders, FASD is never mentioned or rarely mentioned when you're talking about these umbrella terms. We can do better around that. And it's also really important to note that when you Google search what FASD really is, you're not getting a clear picture of some of the more subtle but yet very impactful symptoms, and how many people who are currently accessing our mental health services, our justice services, our parenting education services, our hospital services, our home and shelter, and just general social services, income support, that kind of thing, these services are actually very overrepresented with people who have undiagnosed and unrecognized fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So again, when we know better, we can do better. And I don't care if we call it FASD. I think we need to in terms of prevention, but this is a neurodevelopmental disorder that needs to be better understood. We need psychological evaluations. We need medical practitioners and speech and language pathologists and occupational therapists and nurses and doctors to better understand it so that we can make sure that all of the individual strengths are honored and celebrated, and their areas of difficulty are supported and accommodated. And from my kitchen table to yours, I'm glad that you tuned in today. And if you like what you're listening to, or if you think it's important, please share. I really do think that when we know better, we can do better. And our current prevention efforts are not working. And I really, really believe with everything in me that we could change the landscape in 10 years if we work collectively to share this message in a kind, compassionate, but yet honest and truthful way. People do want healthy pregnancies, yet there's still a lot of mixed messaging out there. So let's do what we can. With many thanks, Angela.